scenario analysis. Thank you, Grace. And thank you to everyone for taking time out of your busy schedules today to join us. I know it's a busy time of the year, and we appreciate you making time for this session. We're going to get underway very promptly today as we have a lot of information to share with you in the next hour. Next slide, please, Grace. So my name is Nick Greenwood, and I'm the lead at Climate here at Novisto, and I'm delighted to be joined by Cedric Robert, CEO of Clearsome, and by David Whittle, Senior Vice President and Head of Clearsome's Climate Risk Practice. The agenda for today is really to cover 4 topics related to climate risk assessment and scenario analysis. I'm going to start with just a very brief overview of some of the reporting requirements on this topic, and then I'll hand over to Cedric and David to give you some insights on conducting a climate risk assessment and scenario analysis, and then how to integrate the conclusions from this analysis into your strategy and into your reporting and disclosures. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions in the chat or pose them directly at the end of the session. And please note we are recording today's webinar, so we'll share a recording with you afterwards as well. Next slide, please, Grace. So as I'm sure you're aware, the TCFD framework is really underpinning all of the new climate disclosure standards that are out there. I imagine that many of you are aligning or already aligned to the TCFD framework. However, one of the consistent challenges that we see and that the TCFD consistently reports on is that companies are struggling with the strategy recommendations. And what these recommendations essentially do is ask companies to disclose the actual and potential impacts of climate-related risks and opportunities on their business. And what we see is in the latest TCFD status report that the TCFD finds that too few companies are disclosing decision-useful climate-related financial information, especially as it relates to the impact of climate change on their businesses, strategies, and financial planning. Indeed, if we look at the chart on the left, which shows the evolution of TCFD disclosures over the last 3 years, we can clearly see that while in strategy recommendation A, which relates to the identification of climate risks using baseline climate risk assessment, there has been a significant improvement. Companies are still struggling a lot with articulating those actual and potential impacts from climate change, particularly as it relates to those forward-looking potential impacts of climate-related risks and opportunities, but also in terms of disclosing their resilience to different future states of the world. Both of these you would typically do with scenario analysis. And in fact, if you look at strategy recommendation C on the resilience of strategy, we can see it's by far the least disclosed element of the TCFD recommendations. Now, why does this matter? Well, we think it matters for 3 reasons. Firstly, climate risks are only going to become more significant and more impactful. For example, for those of you that might have read the 2024 WEF Global Risks Report, physical risk was identified as a top risk most likely to present a material crisis on a global scale this year. So it's really a very significant risk that's rising up the agenda. Secondly, if you look at the feedback that the TCFD has consistently received from users of climate disclosures, they consistently receive feedback from investors and other users that really the information on actual potential impact is extremely valuable for these users. It's right up there with GHG emissions for them in terms of metrics and information that they find useful. And thirdly, and I think this is a very important point, is that we're now moving from a world in which the TCFD was essentially a voluntary framework, in which companies could choose not to disclose on things like their potential impact and resilience, to a world in which we're going to have new climate disclosure standards mandated by jurisdictions around the world, and this is going to be a gap that needs to be addressed. Next slide, please, Grace. So to give you some examples from the 2 main climate disclosure standards, if we look at the IFRS S2 standard, which will be mandatory in a number of jurisdictions around the world, the likes of the UK, Singapore, Australia, Hong Kong, potentially Canada as well. Companies will be required to assess their climate resilience using scenario analysis and disclose the potential anticipated effects of climate-related risks and opportunities on their financial position, performance, and cash flows. Similarly, for those companies that are subject to the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD, in the EU, and for whom climate is material, which is likely most companies, under the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, they will also need to describe the resilience of their strategy and business model using scenario analysis, and disclose the anticipated financial effects for material, physical, and transition risk. Next slide, please, Grace. Not only that, but the direction of travel for both of these standards is really towards expecting companies over time to be able to express the potential impacts of climate change and their resilience to different scenarios in quantitative financial terms. So if we look on the right at the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, for example, the expectation is that companies will be able to provide data on the monetary value and percentage of assets at material, physical, and transition risk prior to the company taking any action to address those, the net revenue and percentage of net revenue from business activities at physical and transition risk, as well as a percentage of assets being addressed by mitigation and adaptation. Similarly, if we look at the IFRS, companies will be expected to disclose cross-industry metrics relating to the amount and percentage of business activities vulnerable to transition and physical risks. Now, it's very important to emphasize here that there is a recognition on behalf of these standard setters that this is a journey. So companies aren't expected to necessarily be able to comply with the quantitative metrics from day one. So in the case of the EU, there's a phase-in provision, which means that companies can omit these disclosures relating to climate risk and actual and potential impacts in the first year of reporting. And then for the first 3 years, they can do it in a qualitative format, but the goal is to get to those quantitative measures. Meanwhile, the IFRS applies a criterion of reasonable and supportable information that is available at the reporting date without undue cost of effort. Now, what that mouthful essentially means is that for things like identification of climate risk and opportunities, potential impacts, physical and transition risk metrics, use of scenario analysis, it means that companies with fewer resources will be allowed to provide more simple, more qualitative disclosures to begin with, and then move up towards more sophisticated financial quantitative disclosures over time. And later in the presentation today, Cedric and David will give some examples of the different levels of sophistication of climate risk assessments and scenario analysis, so you can see a little bit of the evolution of that journey. Finally, just a quick word, next slide please, Grace. For folks in the United States, it obviously remains to be seen if and in what form we may get a potential SEC climate disclosure rule, but I think there are some points here that are relevant. So if we look at the current draft, companies would be required to produce a qualitative assessment of potential impacts from climate risks. And in terms of quantitative information, they would be required to add a note to financial statements for line items where the impact from physical and transition risk was over 1% of that total line item. But scenario analysis would be optional. And then finally, for those companies that might be subject to California SB 261, those are companies that have revenues of over $500 million and that do business in California. Companies will be expected to produce a TCFD report every 2 years, which will again cover these topics. Another way of complying with that would be to do an IFRS S2 climate disclosure. So just to sum up very quickly before I hand over to Cedric and David, climate risks are becoming increasingly relevant for business. Investors and stakeholders really want to know about the potential impact of climate change on your business and your resilience to different scenarios. The gaps that currently exist in voluntary disclosure are going to need to be addressed as new climate disclosure standards become mandatory, and the journey is going to be moving from qualitative to quantitative disclosures over time. And with that, I'll hand over to Cedric to tell you a little bit more about how you can go about addressing those gaps.
Thank you, Nick. I'm just going to show the screen. One second. You'd think we would have this all set up and going really fast by now. There we go. Thanks, Nick, for that introduction and for your first few slides. Very apropos, very timely, and we couldn't echo more your conclusions. Okay, so a few words about ClearSlim, and then we'll dive right in. Who are we? Well, we're a business management consultancy that works at the intersection of climate change, risk and risk management, capital markets, and organizational strategy. What we are is advisors. Essentially, what we're not is we're not accountants. So what you're going to hear today is not investment advice or anything that relates to accounting advisory services. We're strategic advisors, and we present data and information from the perspective of trying to help organizations build climate resilience. As part of this offer and the deal that we have with Novisto, every organization that is on these calls has the opportunity to contact us. I think this is actually extended to everybody at Novisto. to take an hour of our time to explore and discover how we could help you in this disclosure season or beyond. If you're interested, you could contact me directly or through Novisto. I can be reached at cbrobert@clearsum.com, and you just have to say session 2024 Novisto in the tagline, and we'll be happy to get back to you and see how we could help. The goal of today is try to answer the guiding questions of what are climate risk assessments and scenario analysis, and how does this link to integration? And what is integration? What does it mean to move towards assessing and addressing the gaps that Nick just pointed to? Okay. 3 key topics that I will cover with David. The first one, what is a climate baseline assessment? Looking at from the ground up, if you may, leading into scenario analysis. So going further than just looking at today's risks, and then integration into strategy. Let's start from the beginning. What is climate risk? I'm going to try to go through this from a perspective of transmission channels, leading to why capital markets are expecting, wanting to see information about this, and then risk response, or the anticipated risk response. So from the start, climate risks are potential or adverse consequences of a climate hazard or adaptation or mitigation to these hazards. They can be categorized into 2 broad buckets: transition risks and physical risks. Transition risks are those that relate to business and societal shifts or economic shifts that result from the impacts of climate change and its consequences. Physical risks are those that arise from the direct or indirect effects of physical climate change on the environment and your business. These risks have impacts. There are 2 broad categories of impacts that can be anticipated or seen from climate change. The first one being the financial impacts. So what this could do to your business directly in increasing your expenses, increasing your insurance costs as a result of an event, the events that we're seeing right now in California, the atmospheric rivers, or the heat waves, how it could raise your electricity costs, or those are some examples. And societal impacts, those that are direct and indirect consequences on civil society, the well-being of humans and their quality of life and financial health. It's the lack of visibility on these risks and the resulting uncertainty that has given rise to the need for regulations and a transition towards a low-carbon economy that our regulators are trying to get a grasp on through the TCFD and the IFRS and ESRS disclosure standards that we're seeing and impending. The TCFD framework underpins all of these, hence why it is highlighted through and through, and it has and provides a really good framework to look at this. But ultimately, this in turn gives rise to the need for organizations to monitor, measure, and respond. And this is where a strong tie to strategy exists. The goal here is to demonstrate as an organization to your investors and your stakeholders how you're going to respond to these risks, either by adapting, mitigating, or innovating. And we'll come back to that in the end. So through a process of, or an exercise of analyzing and understanding your risks, looking forward into the future, you gain knowledge about how and what to respond to. And the what to respond to may be physical or transition risks. The how would be through adaptation or mitigation. And at the beating heart of all of this will be innovating throughout the process. If we dive in just a little bit further and look at this from a financial system perspective, always looking at this idea of transmission channel, moving from left to right on the screen, these risks will affect businesses, households, and the economy. The impacts on businesses and households, I think, is fairly straightforward and clear. We talked about property damage, disruptions. We've seen some of these impacts in the past. They're just pasted all over the newspapers, basically on a daily basis. Where it becomes really critical is where you see within households the loss of income, the loss of their dwellings, and property damage that could actually impair an ability for anyone to live and survive in those environments. These also have an impact. These risks also have an impact on the economy. They may cause capital depreciation and a need for increased investment in the future. They'll cause shift in prices or may cause major labor friction, socioeconomic changes that result from changes in consumption patterns. We can just think about trying to move towards less, more fuel efficient vehicles as an example of a shift in market preferences. In the end, what our regulators are trying to do is understand, manage, and mitigate the financial risks through putting forward a framework and standards for your organizations. And the risks that they're trying to mitigate are those listed on the right-hand side. So credit risks, market risk, insurance risks, operational risks, and others. Okay, specifically, when we talk about physical risks, let's look at a few examples. I think this is pretty straightforward. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but we're talking about heat waves, as we've seen in Europe last summer, precipitation, what we're seeing today and how that could impede the flow of goods. Last year alone, the railways in Canada were severely impeded from atmospheric rivers in Western Canada, and we could see goods stalled at the ports that couldn't make its way towards central Canada. Storm surges, wildfires, which are intensifying, and droughts, which are affecting not only development, but could affect the utilization of water as part of your processes if your water license in the queue is less of a priority than others, such as for human consumption. Transition risks. The TCFD puts a really great framework and identifies 5 key buckets of what transition risks are. In looking at these, as we're going to talk about what is a baseline climate risk assessment, it's important to understand the breadth of these risks. They include public policies. What legislative pressures and changes are we seeing in motion that will affect how much you emit, that will affect the price of carbon, and how that will cost you in the end and affect your financial performance? Legal risks related to litigation. It could be litigation that is, generally speaking, as a corporation, as an emitter, or it could be as a result of greenwashing, and which could have consequences on your reputation. Technological risks. The investments that you're making today that may no longer be relevant in 5, 10, 20 years. The market risks we identified earlier, so changing consumer behaviors, employee behaviors, lending and insurance costs, just to name a few. And finally, reputational risks, which are really challenging to overcome should they affect your organization. So it is these 2 buckets of risks, the transition and physical risks, that we're trying to assess in a baseline climate risk assessment. So it's fair to say that an underlying assumption here is the understanding and accepting that climate change is not only real, but its impact will have financial consequences, and that these may be material to your organization. To Nick's point, it is likely that climate change will affect your business in one way or the other, whether directly or indirectly through your supply chain. So why do it? What are the benefits, and what are the expected outcomes of a climate risk assessment, what we refer to as a baseline? Well, in essence, a baseline climate risk assessment is essentially the process of identifying, assessing, and prioritizing risks, these 2 types of risks, so that you can understand how this will affect your business. And then from a qualitative to a quantitative perspective, arriving at understanding what this could potentially cost you in the long run if left unabated and unmitigated. What a baseline climate risk assessment does, covering either historical risks to today, what we call present day, or being forward-looking, is enable you to investigate the asset level and at the organizational level, what your exposure is. It's important to know that you're not only doing this because you want to disclose this. There's major upside in doing so. It's a foundation not only for scenario analysis, but it's important because it allows you to understand where you're vulnerable. Is it in your supply chain? Is it in your value chain? Is it in the way that you do business in general? What's your adaptive capacity? Can you respond and be resilient under these circumstances? Nick pointed to resilience assessment, a word that is resonating throughout ESRS, and we will see surfacing time and time again, cannot be done without doing a detailed climate risk assessment. Typically, a climate risk assessment looks at the likelihood of a hazard or of a risk occurring, and how severe the impacts of this risk would be on your business. And finally, 3rd variable, how resilient your organization may be to it. So it's an important input, and we're going to tie this to integration at the end, to how you do M&A, how you manage your capital budget, how you manage your operational budget, and how you recycle capital within your long-term strategy. On the approaches, well, they're different but complementary ways of doing climate change, baseline climate change assessments. In both, when you look at both physical and transition risks, you're going to look at the same components. Essentially, you're going to look at the assets, your value chain, and your supply chain. Something that is common to both is that climate risks, whether physical or transition related, are very geo-specific. So they're related to a place, a country, a continent. An example would be what we know about, or the data we need to understand the flood risk in a region or the heat risk in a region. But the same could be said about policies relating or regulating emissions. These are in Canada, for example, but it's much the same in the States and abroad. They're regulated by a municipal government who then has also accountabilities to a state and then to the federation, as an example. So geography is important. Two distinctions. A physical risk analysis is generally rich in data, very much data-driven, whereas transition risk analysis will have a data-driven component. For example, cost of emissions, managing those emissions, very numbers-driven, and research-based, policy-related. We'll show you an example. And finally, to speak to this journey concept that Nick highlighted in conclusion, this is related to your journey, your firm's maturity. You can either do, as a starting point, a qualitative exercise, and as your organization matures and you start building and investing into this, this will become more and more of a quantitative exercise, and I'll show you in contrast to two. In fact, as an example, we're gonna walk you through here what is a semi-quantitative exercise using a very standard and known risk, which is flood risk affecting buildings, because all of our businesses have operating assets in which we either sell goods, manufacture goods, distribute goods, work as offices from. But before we do so, let's take a look at the basic risk management continuum that underpins the baseline climate risk assessment. In risk management, we like to think about risk as the continuum that you're seeing at the screen here, as 8 key steps that involve governance and strategy setting at the front end, 4 elements that are the key risk management activities, which are risk identification, assessment, and prioritization, and then obvious and of course the response to these, and finally how all of this informs and continues to be informed by risk monitoring and reporting. All of this leading to one thing, the concept of trying to build resilience for the organization. So let's look at an example. How would we go about this at a very high level? Well, in the first place, we try to identify what are those risks that your organization is exposed to. So this can be done from data sources or from research from the market. In the example that we have here, we've identified 5 physical risks and 5 transition risks. The next exercise would be to plot these on a likelihood of impact and severity of impact matrix to understand which of these risks constitute the most likely and impactful to your business. In this example here, we've identified risk number 1, which is a physical risk, flooding, as being meaningful to the business. You then look at the business, all of its operating assets. We've distributed 8 assets here, and try to understand through data that you can obtain, for example, from your insurers or from other data set, what is the frequency or probability of a flood event damaging my property at these locations. You know you have information about your assets. The example we have here puts square footage or square meters for each of these assets in the key municipality where you have exposure. Continuing along this process, you can then start, as you continue assessing this, determine, okay, what would be the cost of repairing these assets in an event of damage? The example we show here, because we have different municipalities and regions, it could be different countries, we have vastly different costs of repairs. If you look at the 4th column here. So what you would do in this exercise, which is a simplified version of what is done, you would multiply these to understand what is the cost of repair should there be damage at these properties. And then you take this data multiplied by the probability of the event occurring to get to a final point, which is these are the costs that a climate-related event like flooding could cause to my business. The next question that comes up is, what do I do about this? Well, in an organization that has a bit of sophistication, you would have appetite statement or risk appetite statements at the governance level. So you would look at the total cost of this risk, and you would compare it once you've understood where your greatest exposure is, once you've prioritized these based on the total cost. How does this compare to what my board of governance and my executive management is willing to take as a risk to determine the type of response that we will take on? In this case here, we have a negative value because the impact anticipated from flood risks in the regions of interest are going to exceed what we expect or have agreed to as an organization were acceptable risks. So it triggers the need for a risk response. You would take this exercise and not only plot the most material risk, which was flooding here, but all the risks that were in the top right quadrant of your likelihood and severity matrix to determine what the total risk is. And then you would contemplate various mitigation or response strategies. In risk management, there are 4 typical risk responses. Those include avoiding, mitigating, transferring, and accepting risk. In this case here, case of flooding, common response is to mitigate. How? By shifting the impact of the threat to a third party like an insurer who now owns that risk. What could happen to you is that you could see your premium as a company augmenting year over year. But the essence of what I just described, this process of how to get from a qualitative exercise of I have seen risks. I understand that they may be material to my organization. I'm assessing how likely and how severe their impacts may be, and then trying to price this out is a process that can be applied throughout the organization as you navigate this process. Now, the same can be said about opportunities. It is exactly the same process, but the difference would be that you would measure the benefits of an opportunity, perhaps through a business case to your executive management or through developing an ROI for that case, in which case the risk responses, positive risks, the opportunities, would include exploiting the opportunity, enhancing it, sharing it with a third party, or plainly accepting it. So without going into further detail here, I'm going to show you 2 examples and then pass the baton to David to talk to you about how does this link to scenario analysis. The first example is a very qualitative exercise where we've applied semi-quantitative elements to it. This was a climate risk assessment that was done for owner of real assets, or real estate in Canada. The ask was to investigate how would policy affect our business down the road. So we were asked to look at what are areas and what are the policies in areas where they have net zero commitments, a requirement for emission reduction targets, and an eventual requirement for energy disclosures. We looked at Ontario as a province, what happens at the provincial level, and then 3 cities specifically. We conducted the assessment and then took that information and started applying the same rules by providing professional judgment to determine how likely and how impactful would be policy risk to this organization and plotting these on a matrix. We use professional judgment from a number of professionals in our firm, and echoed this from surveys that we conducted with the client. At the end, what we did is we plotted and determined or developed a potential financial consequence table, again, taking this semi-quantitative information and trying to understand how this could affect the financial performance of the business. We looked at value at risk, loss of revenue potential, how this could increase costs, increase the cost of capital, money borrowed, and so on and so forth. We've rated the potential consequences, as you see here, and provide a description. This process can largely be done in-house with a ton of knowledge that you have as an organization about your business, with some support from an external party. But it's a good starting point on how to approach conducting a climate risk assessment on the qualitative to semi-quantitative side. Now, the other end of the spectrum is using a very data-driven approach, tools. You're seeing here tools that we've developed at ClearSum, our sister firm, Alter Climate, that shows you how exposed your portfolio of assets, whatever these assets are. Like I said, it could be your operational assets, your manufacturing areas, your warehousing, it could even be routes. And you can start looking at very quantitatively how exposed is your business based on the geographical location and importance of each of these assets. You can determine using a tool like Alter Climate What is your exposure at the asset level? What very specific portions or proportion of your businesses are exposed to coastal flooding, cyclone risks, drought, and so on and so forth? What's the concentration of risk in a geography? And what does it look like at every asset for every asset you have in your business? You can take this further, look at this from a geographical perspective and have visualizations where you can show to your executive and your team essentially where is that exposure and what assets have a degree of exposure. At the end of the day, this more quantitative approach allows you to plug and play into your disclosures, understand where your hazard exposure is. You can start developing then a plan to respond to very specifically, do I have to mitigate? Do I have to adapt? How do I have to innovate to keep my business thriving in a climate constrained environment? So on that note, I'm going to pass the baton to David, and I'll let you walk you through the beginning of scenario analysis and see how it leads us to integration into climate strategy. David.
Thank you, Cedric, and thank you, Nick, also for that excellent introduction. I'm David Whittall. I'm responsible for our climate practice at Clearsome, and I'm delighted to be with you for the next 15 or 20 minutes to introduce Clearsome's approach to scenario analysis. Cedric, let's jump right ahead to the next slide. I'm going to go back to the start. Back to 1967, the father of scenario analysis, Herman Kahn, co-authored a book called The Next 33 Years, A Framework for Speculation. Kahn and his co-author, Anthony Weiner, combined the elements of long-term societal trends with key socioeconomic, technological, and demographic variables to describe plausible states of the world out to the year 2000. By combining these inputs in different ways, they came up with a list of 100 technological innovations that they felt were likely in the coming 3 decades. To read their 1967 list today is astonishing. Automated grocery and department stores, commercial extraction of oil from shale, practical home and business use of video communication, pervasive business use of computers, and my favorite, personal pagers, perhaps even two-way pocket phones, as they called them. With scenario analysis, Kahn and his contemporaries created a decision-making framework that allowed the visualization of multiple plausible futures, a lens for looking beyond past experience and asking, what if? That's what scenario is. It's the ability to ask that question, what if? By combining multiple inputs in different but plausible ways, scenario analysis frees organizations from the constraints of forecasting bounded by historical observations. Climate scenario analysis allows organizations to assess and compare their resilience to climate-related physical and transition risks under either favorable or unfavorable future states, and to map the transition pathways from climate risk to financial statement impact. Scenario analysis is a long-term strategic tool for executive management teams and boards to stress test their organizations. That is a key benefit of performing scenario analysis. Although some corporations have been using scenario analysis since at least the 1970s, the disclosure of decision-useful, climate-related financial information through scenario analysis, especially as it relates to the impact of climate change, has lagged other TCFD-recommended disclosures. And this is despite the fact that the TCFD published a report called The Use of Scenario Analysis and Disclosure of Climate-Related Risks and Opportunities back in 2017. So as Nick pointed out in his opening comments, this is expected to change rapidly as IFRS S2 sustainability standards are adopted in different jurisdictions around the world, as ESRS standards are implemented across Europe, and as companies operating in California, a nearly $4 trillion economy, begin to implement that state's standards in 2026. So climate scenario analysis is gaining momentum and it's going global. Let's take a look at the process. Cedric, could we jump to the next slide, please? Thank you. Scenario analysis, as you can see at the origin cone on the left-hand side of this slide, starts with a core planning question. For Herman Kahn and Anthony Weiner in 1967, the question was, what impact will worldwide industrialization, affluence, and population growth have on per capita incomes in different countries by the year 2000? For a multinational corporation today, the question might be, how will climate change impact our business model by 2050? For a foundation striving to improve nutrition to underserved communities, the question might be, how will more severe chronic physical risk from heat stress and drought affect our mission to deliver food security to underserved populations by 2050? The planning question is followed by the identification of drivers that transmit climate uncertainty into your organization. Drivers include chronic and acute physical risk drivers, as well as transition risk drivers that stem from social, technological, economic, ecological, and political elements. For example, more frequent and extreme precipitation and flooding events could result in more extensive damage to already difficult to insure coastal regions. Displaced homeowners could be temporarily unable to pay their mortgages at the same time that the collateral for the mortgage, their home, is damaged or lost completely. In this example, more frequent and severe coastal precipitation is the driving force that, channeled through the homeowner, results in increased bank credit risk. So once a list of drivers for your organization is identified, drivers can be ranked and prioritized. And from these, future scenarios can be developed for your business. Now, on the right-hand side of this graph, we contrast forecasting, a short-term exercise bounded by past experience and observation, with future scenario planning. Future scenarios may be developed from a reference scenario that begins with essentially a business as usual scenario that splinters into an optimistic or a pessimistic stream. Herman Kahn's scenarios started with what he called the standard world. And from that state, he branched into three different plausible worldviews: an integrated world, an inward-looking world, and then a world in disarray. From variant reference scenarios, customized long-term future scenarios can be developed, and your business's resilience can be stress tested under changing assumptions about your key factors or your key performance indicators. While there are numerous different reference scenarios and different supervisory frameworks for creating these scenarios, there are common elements to the most recognized approaches to climate scenario analysis, and that's what I want to investigate next. Cedric, let's jump to the next slide. So in all cases, the process begins with defining the scope of the exercise. Will it cover your whole enterprise or just a division? Will it be contained to a particular geography? Will it include physical risks or transition risks or both? You can make these decisions at the outset. Beyond that, what will be the time horizon or the time frame for the scenario? Herman Kahn believed in cutting centuries into thirds and looking over 33-year time periods. Climate scenario analysis today tends to consider key climate horizons driven by international agreements, such as the Paris Accord, and national goals. Canada, for example, has the goal to cut emissions by 40% from 2005 levels by 2030, and to reach net zero emissions by 2050. So 2030 and 2050 are key horizons to consider. In a workshop setting, these parameters, including the governance of the scenario analysis, can be set. That means asking the question, who in your organization is going to define the objective, the scope, and the time horizon of your analysis? Who will be involved in conducting the analysis? How will the analysis be incorporated throughout your firm? And how will the waypoints, those metrics and targets that you follow, be incorporated into your analysis? Who will be the audience for that analysis, both the internal and the external audience? It's at this point that you will take the first steps toward designing the scenarios by beginning to identify the key transition risk-related drivers, the key physical risk-related drivers, and discussing the macro parameters like population growth, urbanization, and GDP per capita that are the key determinants of future CO2 emissions and global temperature changes. It's also at this point that you'll develop those waypoints, the signals or markers that help you monitor over time which scenario path your organization seems to be following most closely. Let's jump to the next slide, Cedric. A key step in the scenario analysis process is assessing the financial impacts of the different drivers and then identifying the transmission pathways from a climate risk hazard into your financial performance. In the mortgage example that I brought up a moment ago, the transmission channel for physical climate risk to a bank was the household, specifically the mortgage holder. The financial impact to the bank is credit risk, stemming both from the financial stress on the borrower, but also the damage to the house, the collateral for the bank's mortgage loan. By using scenario analysis, the bank can perform a stress test to examine potential impacts of these climate-related risks on key performance measures of credit risk. The analysis would explore potential preventative measures or responses, and also organizational resilience under different scenarios over the relevant time horizon chosen by the scenario team. Something to consider when building scenarios are the key recommendations of the TCFD about the characteristics of good scenarios. Good scenarios should be plausible, distinctive, consistent, relevant, and challenging. I think challenging is one of the most important words here. Challenging scenarios are what provoke unconventional thinking and have the potential to reveal previously unconsidered vulnerabilities, opportunities, and strategic imperatives. That's one of the things that makes them very different from short-term forecasts. So let's jump to the next slide. Thank you. A few words about the process and also about the reference models that are used. There are significant benefits to building your organizational scenario analysis program around existing public reference scenarios like the IPCC scenarios, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Reference scenarios are based on integrated assessment models that combine human system inputs like population, economic activity, technology, and policy with Earth systems like oceans, the carbon cycle, and the cryosphere, the glaciers and ice. And then modeling outputs like CO2 emissions and temperatures. Multi-model ensembles of global climate models are assembled in periodically updated coupled model intercomparison projects, or CMIPs. And these updates allow modeling and prediction of global climate variables as technology and new information become available. Your customized scenarios can then be built from these based on these globally recognized climate models. Different reference scenarios describe the ranges of plausible outcomes, like those shown on the right-hand side of this slide, given different combinations of these human and Earth system inputs. Cedric, let's jump to the next slide, please. Thank you. So as I mentioned, there are significant benefits to building your organizational scenarios around public reference scenarios. And the key reasons are that these scenarios are authoritative, they're comparable across regions, sectors, and entities, they're regularly updated, and they're based on global multi-model ensembles. And last, they're informationally rich. The selection of the models that you choose may be influenced by the type of regulation or supervision faced by your organization or your primary business activity. Organizations that are regulated by prudential financial regulators or securities exchanges may choose the network for greening the financial sector scenarios because those are produced by central banks and financial supervisors who may also collaborate in the pilots of those scenarios with key financial institutions. Organizations with natural resource or energy focus may choose to use the International Energy Agency scenarios to provide more detail about primary fuels and energy transformation. In any case, once the appropriate standardized reference model is identified, unique organization-level climate drivers can then be incorporated to explore the transmission pathways to the desired organizational financial metrics and key performance indicators. Cedric, may we jump to the next slide, please? Great. Let's talk for a moment about the limitations of scenarios. Climate scenario analysis is a tool, and like most tools, it has its limitations. It's important to understand these. We've already noted that a strength of scenario analysis is that it is not anchored in past experience and observation. That's also a weakness in the sense that scenarios are based on many different assumptions, and they include a limited or finite number of inputs and outputs. So scenarios cannot capture every possibility. They are limited by those inputs and outputs. Some benign modeled climate scenarios of a smooth transition to a Paris-aligned 1.5 degrees of warming may in fact already be implausible. Also, there's no historical experience either of the current rapid rate of global heating or the pace of economic and industrial transformation that's currently underway. A second shortcoming is that modeled scenarios do not incorporate either individual or linked tipping points, and they may therefore be underestimating some risks. Damage from acute and chronic physical risks may be underestimated, especially in the higher emission, higher heating scenarios where cascading tipping points may become more likely. A third limitation to scenarios is in their application. The success of a climate scenario analysis is highly dependent on your team's ability to create traction within your organization. The scenario team needs to build plausible scenarios that are transparent and they're free from the feeling of being a black box. Building internal credibility happens from deep discussions about the assumptions that are underlying your scenarios and the drivers identified for the analysis. Strategic thinkers from across your company need to be engaged in that process. The scenario team should not be a small, obscure project hidden within your investor relations effort. It should be a high-profile thought leadership group right at the heart of your organization. Let's jump to the last slide, Cedric, and I'll close here. To wrap up, successful use of climate scenario analysis in organizational strategy requires the full support of the leadership group. Scenarios are plausible future states. They're not forecasts. Caution and conservatism should be used in the interpretation of the results. Under any selected representative scenario, a key organizational exercise is going to be determining those driving forces that are unique to your organization. Understanding the plausible risk transmission channels from climate hazards and climate scenario drivers into your financial performance is an important exercise that needs to be updated regularly as the climate, society, and your own organization evolves. Finally, identifying waypoints and markers and maintaining and monitoring those is an important element of a successful scenario analysis program. When Herman Kahn and his co-author Anthony Weiner wrote their book in 1967, the world was full of peril and promise, just as today. The Vietnam War was in full swing at that time. Israel had gone to war against Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. China was in the throes of a cultural revolution, and Montreal was hosting the World Expo with a theme of hope, the motto of which was man and his world. Today, while much is different, one thing remains the same. The world is an uncertain place with existential challenges and unseen opportunities. Transitioning to a net zero economy by 2050 has been identified as the most significant social and industrial transformation ever undertaken. Imagination, curiosity, and flexibility in the face of this change will be key leadership skills for organizations. Climate scenario analysis can provide you with a structured forum for contemplating the big what if questions. I now turn it back to Cedric to make some concluding comments about integrating climate scenario analysis into your strategy and disclosures. Over to you, Cedric.
Thanks, David. Okay. Looking at all of this and trying to bring this back to reporting, what does this mean? And how can you build on this from what you've just learned or what we shared with you? Let's look at a couple things in a first place. Let's look at what is or what are the foundational elements to a good climate, what we consider a good climate strategy. What you've heard today is about the climate risks, what they are today, the longer run, which is the future, what David explained. And strategy is partly about the long game and partly about understanding your risks, and most importantly, how you perform under these different futures that are going to evolve. As we introduced at the start of the sessions, there are three key, as of today's session, there's three key responses that we're expecting of a good climate risk or a good climate strategy. This response is expected from capital markets. It's essentially the response to the immediate pressures that your organization's impact are having on our climate and responding to the longer term need to adapt to how climate change will influence our economy and our world. And at the heart of this is a constant need for innovation and agility. And as we know, a sound climate strategy needs and means managing your business's impact, but also in that, I mean, your GHG emissions, which is critical, but it's not the only thing in the picture here. We have to take this broader lens to look at the need to adapt and the need to build resilience. Because the fact is that we're seeing changes and those changes are going to be impactful. So how do we integrate all of these concepts into a strategy, and how do we tie that back to reporting? Let's look at this for a minute. When we talk about integration and how this links to reporting, but integration in and of itself, what is it? It's the process of embedding climate-related consideration in your strategic planning, in your decision-making, in your operations. It's driven by the fact that you've identified your risks, you've recognized and identified your opportunities, and you can apply learnings from what you've learned from looking forward or into the future through the process of scenario analysis. We look at this, and when we think about the work that needs to be done and how to communicate it, we think about these 8 pillars, what you have at the screen. And I'd encourage you to take a screenshot of this because I think this could help you guide on how you're going to be reporting about what you're doing. These elements are key. For the purpose of, say, a lower maturity organization, we might be looking at establishing what do we know as a knowledge base for our organization. Do we have some training packages? Have we developed institutional knowledge or savoir-faire? What could we do and how could we help our supply chain? What are initiatives that could be put in place? What do we know about risks? A good starting point might be to just say sector-wise or industry-wise, what are the risks associated with what we do in general? And then think about the risk management continuum and start digging into this piece by piece to start building governance strategy and other elements so that you can show that you are in the process of managing this, of learning and advancing along that journey. Then, of course, there's the risk response. The large focus on decarbonization starts with managing the data that comes with your emissions. Adapting, what are you doing about adaptation? And then looking at your business model may come slightly later in this process because it comes from having a sound understanding of the 2 above risk management responses. It also means talking about opportunities. And again, as a starting point in your disclosures, you can start looking at the low-hanging fruit of opportunities. But we like to frame them in the concept or in the context of asset preservation, increasing revenues, and trying to find ways to reduce costs. All places where you can start integrating knowledge and start sharing this knowledge in your disclosures. Two elements that Navisto facilitates largely are the data management side. And a really important thing to note when you talk about disclosures and you think about the work to be done is where are we at in terms of data in terms of its quality? Are we in the estimation world or are we in the measurement world? And that is a gradient. Announcing that you're working towards measurement is a valuable piece of information to know. And when you communicate with the outside world, we like to think of disclosures as having these top three elements as being essential. Essentially, positioning your knowledge statements. What do you know about climate risks, climate change in your business? Positioning what actions are underway or completed. What are you seeing in the short, moderate, and long term? And your actions planned. What are those projects that you're going to undertake to deepen your knowledge? Of course, there's then internal communications and all of this leading to a meaningful disclosures. And as you advance on your maturity scale, then you'll look at the impacts on finance, and maybe you'll consider the return on investments of some of these opportunities and projects, or setting in internal carbon pricing. Talk about the financial materiality of climate risks on your business and start doing work that is much deeper, like stress testing. You might also be looking at subsidies and programs that could help your bottom line and help you initiate some activities, and lending facilities like sustainability-linked loans or bonds. But the places where you may want to look for integration opportunities are around, I would consider some low-hanging fruits, establishing policies around how you're going to do business, looking at where there's friction in your value chain or in your supply chain by just looking at hotspots around emissions. How could you invest or influence your investment process is another place where we would contemplate how to integrate climate considerations. You may not want to buy an asset or exploit an asset in an area that has high exposure to a risk because you have learned this from your research on my industry is exposed to this. I should look more deeply here, and so on and so forth. And then you can integrate on CapEx and OpEx. And obviously, there's a whole concept of tying all of these measures or steps into remuneration for the teams and the executive management group. And I'm going to leave you with one last thing, and then I'm going to quickly pass it on to Nick here. It's important to know that the cost of identifying, understanding, and prioritizing forward-looking climate risks doesn't have to be exorbitant. It doesn't have to be a large or substantial initiative. You'd be surprised to see how much can be done. And a bit of research goes a long way. I'm going to reiterate that we have proposed an hour of consultation with every single one of you, and we're happy to take that time to have a discussion and go through questions that you may have on how to better position your disclosures around climate risks and preparing the world for whatever you're about to do with respect to scenario analysis. Nick, I know there's only a couple questions in the chat. I'll give you the baton at this point. I want to thank you for this opportunity to host us today, and I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much, Cedric and David. So there is a question in the chat. It's, are people still referring to the TCFD since it's been disbanded? And I can take that one. So the reason TCFD was disbanded is because it completed its mission. So it's not that TCFD was unsuccessful or has been outdated. It's simply that the new standards have incorporated everything that the TCFD set out in the framework, and they've made it more specific. One of the reasons why we still refer to TCFD is because as a framework for thinking things through, those four pillars and how they intersect and how you integrate them into your strategy are very useful at a high level for thinking about this stuff, but it's also the DNA that's underpinning all of the different climate disclosure standards. So you'll continue to see the TCFD referenced quite a bit, even if it, as an organization, has been disbanded. And that's why you will hear a lot about TCFD. I think also one of the key recommendations we have is, as you gear up for those climate disclosure standards, aligning to the TCFD and starting bit by bit to look at the weak points and where your gaps are on TCFD is an excellent way to move forward. And just a final question perhaps for you, Cedric, for a company that's just starting out on this climate risk assessment journey and scenario analysis, what would you suggest as sort of the sequencing? What should they do first step?
Good question. I think the first place I would look is, as I mentioned a bit earlier, what is happening in my industry? What is happening in my sector, and what are those climate risks that are popping up? An easy way to get access to this information is maybe canvass what your competitors are doing. You can also look at various databases to see, okay, I see physical risks arising, transition risks arising. I hear of carbon tax frameworks. I hear of carbon pricing requirements or disclosure requirements around energy use, and to start digging into what are the locales doing. And that's just an exercise of research that can be easily done to start teasing out risks that you could identify and put forward. The next step would be to assessing these. Now, assessing these requires a bit of perhaps support and certainly a collaborative effort within the organization. So bring in some people from different areas in your business, people from finance, people from acquisition and mergers, and people from strategy, and see what you can tease out that could be relevant there. So digging into this, then I would say identification is a simple place to begin, stating those risks, then going to assessing and prioritizing, whether it's qualitatively or quantitatively. And then there are sources of information that will tell you what the future has in stores with respect to climate risks. There are models out there. We'd be happy to show you and expose you to this. But this is where I would start, Nick. And again, I'd position this with respect to here's what we know, here's what we've done, and here's what we're going. And be rich on where you're going, of course, committing to only things that you're willing to do. That's kind of how I would frame it with every client.
Fantastic. Just one very last question before we go. Can you speak a little bit about time frame and resources required? I guess this is a bit of how long is a piece of string, but just any quick words on that.
Certainly. Well, it depends what you're looking to do. It's in I mentioned resources. If it's financial resources, you could get a really easy perspective on what are your forward-looking risks for every single one of your assets in a horizon of a few weeks, 4 to 6 weeks, perhaps. And I mentioned costs that could be as low as $25,000 or something like that. If you want to go into a cursory level, yet sufficiently detailed that you can have a forward-looking into the future. It could get quite pricey and quite lengthy once you start doing detailed analysis about how will this impact my business and how will I mitigate or manage these risks. But in this continuum, again, you identify, you assess, you focus on the risks that are prioritized, you allocate resources there, you give yourself a sense of what the future has in stores for you by looking at forward-looking risks, hazards, and how that could affect the business. And then you can start looking year over year how to build on this. Starting small, everybody starts small. And I think that that's a very reasonable approach that is aligned with the expectations of the IFRS and the ESRS.
Exactly. Well, thank you very much, Cedric and David. We've reached the end of the hour. We're slightly over. Thank you to everyone who attended. We will send a copy of the recording to you. And yes, of course, feel free to reach out to Cedric and David if you want to hear more. So thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you all.